In the summer of 2008, authorities in Bisbee, Arizona received a 911 call that would later become one of the strangest incidents ever connected to the abandoned Copper Queen mining network. The call came from a group of urban explorers who had entered a sealed section of the old mine sometime after sunset. The recording lasted only 43 seconds. At first, the caller sounded out of breath, almost panicked. He repeatedly said that they had found people living beneath the mines. But then he added something much stranger. There are people down here, but they're not miners. A second voice can be heard asking what was standing in the tunnel ahead of them. Then there is screaming, metallic banging, someone yelling to run. And then the call suddenly ends. Search teams spent 3 days looking through the abandoned mine system. Only one member of the group was ever found. 20-8-year-old Ethan Mercer was discovered wandering near Mule Pass, severely dehydrated and barely able to speak. According to deputies, Ethan kept repeating the same sentence over and over again. Why did they have our faces? The remaining 3 explorers were never found. Large portions of the official case file remain sealed to this day, and only weeks after the incident, federal authorities permanently closed the entrance where the group had disappeared. No public explanation was ever given. Before the incident, Ethan Mercer was relatively unknown online. He was 28 years old and lived in Flagstaff, Arizona. Friends described him as quiet, intelligent, and a little obsessive when it came to forgotten places. For nearly 6 years, Ethan had been researching abandoned mining towns across the American Southwest. He ran a small internet forum dedicated to unexplained disappearances, local legends, and lost historical sites. Most of his posts focused on old maps, missing records, and stories that had somehow been forgotten. According to archived forum posts, Ethan became interested in Bisbee after finding several conflicting mining maps from the early 1900s. Some showed tunnels that simply did not exist on modern records. Others appeared to extend thousands of feet deeper underground. He believed parts of the mine had been intentionally erased. Joining him on the trip was 20-6-year-old photographer Sarah Delaney. Unlike Ethan, Sarah was a skeptic. She had documented abandoned locations for years and often dismissed paranormal claims as exaggerations or local folklore. Friends said she only agreed to the trip because she thought the old mines would make for an interesting documentary project. The third member was Luke Ramirez, a former geology student from Tucson. Luke had explored dozens of abandoned mines and understood how dangerous they could be. He was the one who repeatedly warned everyone not to go too deep. The final member of the group was Brandon Pike. Brandon was 27 and had become interested in conspiracy theories after researching missing persons cases online. He believed the government hid information about certain disappearances in remote areas. Archived messages show that Brandon was particularly interested in rumors surrounding Bisbee. Rumors about sealed tunnels, missing miners, and stories of people hearing voices coming from beneath the mountains. Before entering the mines, the group spent 2 days speaking with local residents. Most refused to discuss the old tunnels. One elderly retired miner became visibly uncomfortable when Ethan showed him the older maps. According to Ethan's notes, the man stared at the papers for nearly a minute before quietly saying, "The mine doesn't end where the maps say." When Ethan asked what he meant, the man reportedly stood up and walked away. He refused to answer any more questions. At the time, the group thought it was simply another local ghost story. But according to the only survivor, that was the moment they should have left Bisbee. Bisbee, Arizona is a real town located in the Mule Mountains, only a few miles from the Mexican border. Today, it is known mostly as a historic mining town and tourist destination. But in the late 1800s and early 1900s, it was one of the richest copper-producing regions in America. Thousands of miners once lived there. Entire mountains were hollowed out by tunnels, shafts, and underground chambers. Even now, many of those passages remain. UNMAPPED. Old newspaper records mention numerous accidents throughout the mining boom. Cave-ins. Gas leaks, equipment failures, but some reports are stranger. Several articles briefly mention workers disappearing underground without explanation. In one case from 1911, an entire survey crew reportedly vanished during a routine inspection. No bodies were ever recovered. As mining operations slowed, stories began spreading among local residents. Stories about figures seen near old ventilation shafts, stories of voices echoing from sealed tunnels. And stories of men who returned from underground. Different locals eventually gave these stories a name. They called them the Hollow Miners. According to the legend, strange people occasionally emerged from forgotten mine entrances at night. They looked human, but something about them always seemed wrong. Their movements. Their expressions, the way they spoke. Most residents dismissed the stories as superstition. Still, some parts of the mining network remain permanently sealed officially. These closures were due to structural instability. Unofficially, nobody seemed willing to explain why certain areas were never reopened. When Ethan compared historical maps with modern records, he found something disturbing. Several deep shafts shown on older surveys no longer existed on any public documents. It was as if entire sections of the mines had simply been erased. The question was, why? And more importantly, what had been discovered down there that was important enough to hide. According to timestamps recovered from Brandon Pike's camera, the group entered the abandoned section of the mine shortly before sunset. At first, nothing seemed unusual. The tunnels were exactly what they expected. Dust. Collapsed support beams, rusting equipment. But after less than an hour underground, they began noticing things that didn't make sense. Luke was the first to point out that several rocks near one of the tunnel entrances appeared to have been moved recently. There were no signs of weathering. No dust buildup. As if someone had passed through only days earlier. A few minutes later, Sarah discovered footprints. Fresh footprints. The prints continued deeper into the mine before suddenly ending against a solid rock wall. No return tracks were visible. Then they heard the knocking. 3 slow metallic impacts somewhere deeper underground. Everyone stopped. A few seconds later, the same knocking sound repeated. Luke suggested it could be old metal shifting in the heat, but according to the recovered footage, the sounds continued at regular intervals, almost like a signal. As they moved farther in, Sarah noticed strange carvings on the tunnel walls. The symbols didn't resemble mining markings. They appeared far older. Some looked almost ceremonial. Nearby, the group found several objects that should not have been there. Modern food wrappers, burned candles, and children's drawings. The drawings showed crude human figures standing beside unusually tall people with distorted faces and long limbs. Nobody could explain who had left them. As night fell outside, the atmosphere inside the mine changed. Several members later claimed they felt as if they were being watched. Then Brandon's camera captured something far down one of the shafts. A pale figure was standing completely still. The group had not noticed it at the time, but when they reviewed the footage later, everyone became quiet because the figure appeared to resemble Ethan. The problem was Ethan had been standing beside the camera when the footage was recorded. Most people would have left at that point, but according to messages recovered from Brandon's camera, the group believed they had stumbled onto evidence of squatters or an unknown group living beneath the mines. Ethan, in particular, became convinced that they had discovered one of the forgotten tunnel systems shown on the older maps. Against Luke's advice, they continued deeper. Nearly an hour later, they found something that should not have existed. Hidden behind a partially collapsed wall was an old industrial elevator shaft. None of the public maps mentioned it. Even stranger, the elevator still had power. A single dim light glowed above the controls. Luke reportedly became nervous immediately. He later stated that the machinery looked far older than the rest of the mining equipment around it. After several minutes of arguing, they decided to descend. The deeper they went, the stranger the tunnels became. The rock formations changed. The support structures disappeared. Some sections no longer looked man-made. It was as if the mines had broken into something much older. Scattered throughout the tunnels were personal belongings, old lanterns, rusted helmets, hundreds of abandoned boots, but no bodies. Then Ethan discovered a damaged journal dated 1911. Several pages were unreadable, but some entries remained. One line simply read, "People below us." Another entry stated, "3 men came back this morning. They looked like our workers, but something was wrong." Further down the page, someone had written, "They imitate voices." Nobody said much after reading that. Eventually, the group came across what appeared to be an old underground camp. Collapsed tents were scattered around the area. There were medical supplies, generators, and several military crates from the 1960s. Any identifying markings had been scratched away. Brandon immediately began talking about government experiments. At first, everyone laughed. Then they heard their own voices. Somewhere in the darkness ahead, they could hear echoes of conversations they had just had. At first it seemed normal, until the responses changed. When Sarah said, "I think we should leave," another voice repeated the sentence a few seconds later, except it ended differently. "I think we should stay." Nobody moved. Then Ethan heard his own voice coming from deeper in the tunnels, quietly saying, "Come down here." According to the recovered recordings, nobody spoke for nearly 2 minutes after that, because every single person in the group had heard it, and Ethan had never said those words. Eventually, the group decided to follow one of the side tunnels, branching away from the camp. The passage narrowed for several hundred feet before opening into a hidden chamber. What they found inside would later become one of the most disturbing details in the entire case. The room appeared to have been used by multiple people over many decades. The walls were covered with photographs, hundreds of them. Some were black and white, others were much newer. There were missing person posters dating back to the 1940s. Old police reports, drivers, licenses, children's toys, personal belongings, from people who had disappeared all across Arizona. But the photographs were the worst part. Many of them showed ordinary people standing beside someone who looked exactly like them. The copies were not perfect. Something always seemed slightly wrong. A smile that looked forced, eyes that seemed too large, limbs that appeared too long. Then Sarah found several photographs of Ethan. Everyone initially assumed they had been taken recently. Until they noticed the dates. Some were marked 1978. Others were dated 1983, years before Ethan Mercer had even been born. As the group tried to understand what they were seeing, Sarah discovered a collection of old cassette tapes. One recording contained The voice of a miner speaking in a terrified whisper. "They keep replacing people." Another voice interrupted him. "If anyone finds this, don't trust anyone who comes back." At that exact moment, they realized Luke was missing. Nobody had seen him leave. Several minutes passed before he suddenly emerged from another tunnel. His clothes were covered in dust. There was blood beneath his nose, and he seemed strangely calm. He claimed he had become lost, but according to Brandon's footage, Luke never explained where he had gone. More importantly, nobody could determine how long he had actually been missing. Because every watch in the group had stopped at exactly the same time. According to Ethan's later testimony, this was the point where panic slowly began turning into disbelief. The group no longer believed they were dealing with squatters or an abandoned government site. Something else was down there, and it had been there for a very long time. Not long after Luke returned, they noticed a faint light coming from a tunnel farther below. Against their better judgment, they followed it. The passage eventually opened into an enormous underground cavern. The ceiling disappeared into darkness. At first, they thought they had discovered another abandoned mining settlement. There were structures in the distance. Fires. Movement. People. Dozens of them. The figures stood silently, watching. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then Brandon raised his camera. That was when they realized something was wrong. The people were not moving naturally. Their movements seemed delayed. As if they were copying behavior they did not fully understand. Some had unusually long arms. Others had faces that appeared slightly stretched. A few stood completely still, smiling. Then one of them stepped forward. It spoke using the voice of an old miner from the recordings. Another answered using Sarah's voice. Then another used Brandon's. According to Ethan, hearing their own voices coming from strangers was one of the most terrifying experiences of his life. Then one of the figures walked into the light. It had Ethan's face, not something similar. Not a resemblance. It looked exactly like him. The only difference was its expression. It smiled too widely. Its eyes never blinked. More figures emerged from the darkness. One resembled Sarah. Another looked partially like Brandon. Some appeared unfinished, as if they were still learning how humans were supposed to look. Ancient symbols covered the cavern walls. The same symbols Sarah had photographed earlier, only now there were thousands of them. Ethan later claimed the symbols appeared much older than the mines themselves. It suddenly became horrifyingly clear. The miners had never built this place. They had uncovered it, and whatever was living beneath Bisbee had likely been there long before the first tunnel was ever dug. Then, the creature wearing Ethan's face quietly asked a question. "Why did you come back?" None of them had ever been there before. At least, that's what they believed. Nobody knows exactly what happened next. The recovered footage becomes fragmented at this point, and Ethan's statements changed several times during later interviews. But all versions of his story begin the same way. Everyone started running. The figures did not immediately chase them. Instead, they simply watched. Some smiled. Others repeated phrases the group had spoken earlier. As Ethan and the others fled through the tunnels, they realized something even more disturbing. The mine no longer matched their maps. Passages that had existed minutes earlier were gone. New tunnels had appeared where solid rock should have been. Several routes looped back on themselves. It was as if the entire underground system was changing. Then Luke suddenly stopped. According to Ethan, Luke turned around and calmly said, "They don't want us to leave." Before anyone could respond, he grabbed Brandon and shoved him to the ground. A struggle followed. Brandon screamed for help. Ethan later claimed Luke's face looked different. Not physically different, just wrong, like he was pretending to be himself. During the confusion, Brandon disappeared. No one saw where he went. Then they heard him. His voice echoed through the tunnels. "Guys, over here." Sarah tried to follow it. Then another Brandon called out from a different direction. Then another. Soon, his voice was coming from everywhere. Some were begging for help. Others were laughing. As they ran, Ethan and Sarah briefly looked into one of the deeper chambers. What they saw there would haunt Ethan for the rest of his life. Dark pools covered the cavern floor. Inside them were shapes, human shapes. Bodies that appeared to be forming. Faces slowly emerging from the black liquid. Some resembled miners. Others resembled people from the photographs. One looked exactly like Sarah. Another looked exactly like Ethan. The copies were still moving, still changing, still becoming. Eventually, Ethan and Sarah reached the elevator shaft. Neither of them remembered seeing Luke again. The elevator somehow still worked, and by sunrise, they had escaped the mine. At least, that is what Ethan believed. Because only a few hours later, Sarah disappeared from the motel where they were staying. Security footage showed her calmly leaving the building. Shortly after midnight, walking beside her was a man who looked exactly like Ethan Mercer. The real Ethan was asleep in another room at the time, or at least, he claimed he was. By the morning of August 14, 2008, local authorities had launched a large-scale search operation. Deputies, volunteers, and mine rescue personnel entered the abandoned sections of the Copper Queen network looking for the missing explorers. According to official reports, they found almost nothing. No hidden settlement. No underground camp. No photographs. No evidence that anyone had been living beneath the mines. Even the elevator shaft described by Ethan could not be located. The The only things recovered were a damaged flashlight and portions of Brandon Pike's camera equipment. Within 48 hours, several federal agents arrived in Bisbee. Their involvement raised immediate questions. Missing persons cases in remote areas rarely attracted that level of attention so quickly. Witness statements were collected and portions of the search records were sealed. The official explanation eventually released to the public was simple. The group had entered unstable tunnels, become disoriented, and suffered from dehydration and hallucinations. But several details did not fit that explanation. During psychological evaluations, Ethan repeatedly described locations beneath the mine that did not appear on any public records. He also mentioned names of miners who had disappeared in the early 1900s, names that investigators later confirmed were real. There was another problem. According to one report leaked years later, Ethan's fingerprints showed minor inconsistencies when compared with older employment records and identification files. The differences were small, but they were enough to concern investigators. Even stranger were references found inside internal government documents. Several pages reportedly mentioned something called Project Deep Lantern. Another document contained the phrase, human mimicry phenomenon. Shortly after these records were discovered, they disappeared. Officials denied they had ever existed, and only weeks later, the entrance used by the explorers was permanently sealed by federal order. No reason was ever publicly given. For several years, the Bisbee incident slowly faded from public attention. Then, in 2017, an independent journalist named Rebecca Vance reopened the case. She became interested after obtaining copies of old newspaper articles mentioning unexplained disappearances in Arizona mining towns. The deeper she looked, the stranger the pattern became. Similar cases appeared in Nevada. In parts of Utah, even in cave systems throughout Appalachia. Different locations. Different decades, but the details were often the same. People disappeared underground. Some returned acting strangely. Others were reportedly seen twice. Rebecca also discovered native legends describing beings that lived beneath the earth. Creatures that copied human appearance and lured people into caves using familiar voices. Eventually, she tracked down a retired federal agent who agreed to speak anonymously. According to his testimony, the government had become aware of these entities sometime during the 1950s. Several remote mining communities had allegedly been quietly evacuated. After a series of unexplained incidents, secret programs were established to study what officials referred to as adaptive subterranean intelligences. Attempts were reportedly made to communicate with them. The results were classified. Before ending the interview, the former agent made one final statement, a statement that would later become infamous online. "We never confirmed how many existed underground." He then paused, "and we never confirmed how many made it to the surface." Rebecca's investigation led her back to Ethan Mercer. After comparing old recordings and interviews, she noticed subtle differences. Small things. Memories that no longer matched earlier statements. Changes in speech patterns. Different habits. Even his family reportedly claimed that he seemed different. Not dramatically different, just not entirely like the man who disappeared in 2008. Rebecca planned to publish her findings, but she never did. On March 3, 2018, she vanished while traveling through northern Arizona. Her vehicle was later discovered abandoned. Inside was her recorder. The final audio file contained only 17 seconds of sound, a series of metallic knocking noises, and a voice that sounded exactly like Ethan Mercer quietly saying, "You shouldn't have come back." Officially, the case remains unsolved. Brandon Pike, Sarah Delaney, and Luke Ramirez are still listed as missing. No bodies were ever recovered. No charges were ever filed, and the federal government has never commented on its involvement in the incident. But the story did not end in 2008. Over the years, hikers and local residents have continued reporting strange sounds coming from abandoned mine entrances around Bisbee. Most describe hearing distant metallic knocking. Others claim they heard people calling their names from inside sealed tunnels. Then, in late 2024, a video appeared online. The footage showed a man entering a restricted mine entrance somewhere in southern Arizona. The man strongly resembled Brandon Pike, despite the fact that Brandon had been missing for 16 years. The video lasted less than 2 minutes. Near the end, knocking sounds could be heard from deeper inside the tunnel. The camera slowly turned. A pale face emerged from the darkness. At first, it looked unfamiliar. Then its features began to change. The eyes, the mouth, the shape of the face, until it looked exactly like Ethan Mercer. The footage cuts out immediately afterward. To this day, the entrance remains sealed. A warning sign still stands outside. Unauthorized entry prohibited. Authorities continue to refuse comment. And perhaps the most disturbing question remains unanswered. If something really was living beneath the copper mines of Bisbee, how many of them are still down there, and how many are no longer underground?